2 years ago, David was involved in a terrible car accident while driving back to California from Mexico.
There was a problem with the car, and I landed in the highway with my head first.
Okay.
But like this truck that is coming by, that's what I want.
For 5 weeks, David lay in a coma. To everyone's relief, when he regained consciousness, his mental capacities seemed to be intact.
He was articulate, he was intelligent, not obviously psychotic or emotionally disturbed. He could read a newspaper. Everything seemed fine, except he had one profound delusion. He would look at his mother, and he would say, "This woman, doctor, she looks exactly like my mother. But in fact, she's not my mother. She's an imposter. She's some other woman pretending to be my mother."
The injury to David's brain had brought on a very rare condition called the Capgras Delusion.
I was cooking dinner, and he probably didn't like the food that night.
Okay.
And he said, "You know, the lady who comes in the morning, she cooks much better than you.
Okay.
It's that lady. I like that lady very much."
Okay.
Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. You walk downstairs. Your wife is making coffee. She turns around and smiles at you. Same face, same voice, same laugh lines around her eyes. But something is wrong. You can't explain it. You can't point to anything specific. But somewhere deep in your gut, deeper than logic, deeper than reason, you know. That is not your wife. It looks like her, it sounds like her. It knows things only she would know. But it's not her. Someone or something has taken her place. And whatever is standing in your kitchen, smiling at you, is a perfect imposter. Now imagine that feeling never goes away. Imagine it's not a nightmare you wake up from. Imagine it's your life, every morning, every conversation, every hug from someone you once loved, filtered through an unshakable, absolute certainty that the person in front of you is a fraud. This is Capgras Syndrome, and it is one of the most philosophically disturbing conditions the human brain can produce. One of the most frequently cited cases in the literature involves a man in his 40s who suffered a traumatic brain injury in a car accident.
David was also convinced that his father was an imposter.
He would say to his dad, "You know, I'm sure you would like to meet this guy. He's so much like you, but he drives better. He doesn't go so fast."
Capgras Syndrome, also called Capgras Delusion, is a rare psychiatric and neurological condition in which a person becomes absolutely convinced that someone they know, usually someone emotionally close to them, has been replaced by an identical imposter. Not similar, not almost the same, identical, down to every last detail. The condition was first described in 1923 by French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras and his colleague Jean Riboul-Lachaud. Their patient, a woman they referred to only as Madame M, was convinced that her husband, her children, and even herself had been replaced by doubles.
Amazingly, David sometimes referred to himself as the other David, as if his own self were an imposter.
The Capgras delusion has been known since the turn of the century, but has been treated as a curiosity, an anomaly. The standard explanation, which you find in most psychiatry textbooks, is a Freudian one, and the idea is something like this. This young man, like most young people, when he was an infant growing up, he had strong sexual attraction to his mother, the so-called Freudian Oedipus complex. But then along comes a blow to the head, and suddenly and inexplicably, these sexual urges come flaming to the surface, and he finds himself sexually attracted to his mother, and he says, "My God, if this is my mother, how come I'm attracted to her? How come I'm aroused? This must be some other strange woman." Now, this is an ingenious explanation, but it doesn't quite work. Because I've seen a patient who has the same delusion about his pet dog. He'll look at his pet dog and say, "Doctor, this is not Fifi. It looks just like Fifi, but in fact it's been replaced by another identical dog." So how does the Freudian explanation account for this? Unless you start talking about the inherent bestiality in all human beings or something like that.
Capgras named the phenomenon the illusion of doubles. That word, illusion, is actually misleading. A hallucination is something that isn't there. A delusion is a fixed false belief. What Capgras patients experience is something more specific than either. They perceive correctly but interpret catastrophically. They see your face, they just don't feel it. To understand why Capgras happens, you need to understand how your brain normally recognizes the people you love. It's not a single process, it's two simultaneous parallel processes, and they're supposed to work together. The first is the visual recognition pathway. When you see someone's face, your visual cortex processes the image, the features, the structure, the geometry of what you're looking at. This travels through a region called the fusiform face area, which is specifically tuned to faces, and then connects to regions like the temporal cortex that store memories of people you know. This process answers the question, do I recognize this face? The second pathway runs in parallel. It routes facial information through the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, which generates what neurologists call an autonomic affective response, a feeling of familiarity, a warmth, a sense of this is someone I know. This process answers the question, do I feel like I know this face? In healthy brains, both systems fire together. You see your mother's face and you recognize it, and you feel recognition simultaneously. The two signals arrive together. You reinforce each other, and you experience seamless, unambiguous familiarity. In Capgras Syndrome, the second pathway is damaged or disconnected. The visual recognition system still works. The patient still identifies the face correctly, but the emotional signal, the feeling of familiarity, never arrives. The face is recognized by the cortex, but not felt by the limbic system. The result is a perpetual mismatch that the brain finds intolerable. Because we expect familiarity to feel like something, and when it doesn't, when you see your husband's face and feel absolutely nothing, no warmth, no recognition, no sense of this is mine, the brain scrambles for an explanation. And the explanation it lands on is, this is not him.
Ramachandran's hunch that David's delusions were being caused by the rupture of specific brain circuits was lent unexpected weight when David's mother recalled a breakthrough with the phone.
Increasingly, and this detail matters, when his father called him on the phone, he had no such feeling. Over the phone, his father was his father. It was only face-to-face that his delusion activated. This gives us a crucial clue. Phone calls don't involve visual face processing. They're purely auditory, which means the disruption wasn't in memory or emotion in general. It was specifically in the visual emotional pathway. The face triggered the anomaly. The voice did not.
David, ¿cómo estás? Tu papi.
We got so tired of him saying, you're not my dad, you're not my mother, you're my mother. We decided, okay, you go downstairs, call on the phone and said, David, hi. And on the phone, he would know he was his dad. On the phone, he never, ever
Had this problem. So on the phone, he'd always recognize
on the phone
as his father.
As his father. No problem.
When he saw him in person, he would say, you look like my father, but
you're not
really
my father. No.
This shows the patient is not crazy. Why would he be crazy in person, but not on the phone? The answer is, there's a separate pathway that goes from the auditory cortex, the hearing part of the temporal lobe, to the amygdala. And that pathway was not damaged in David by the car accident. Therefore, when he listens to his father on the phone, there is no delusion.
Yeah, great.
Whenever we look at an object or a face, the message reaches the temporal lobes, where it's identified. But then it gets relayed to a structure called the amygdala, which is the gateway to the limbic system that contains the emotional centers of the brain. And it's here that we generate the appropriate emotional response to whatever it is we're looking at.
Now, what I've suggested is that what's going on in this patient is the message gets to the temporal lobe cortex, so the patient recognizes his mother as being his mother and evokes the appropriate memories, but the message doesn't get to the amygdala because the fibers going from the temporal lobe cortex to the amygdala and to the emotional centers are cut as a result of the accident. Therefore, there is no emotion, there is no warmth. And he says, if this is really my mother, why is it I'm not experiencing any emotions? There's something not quite right here. Maybe she's some other strange woman pretending to be my mother.
This theory, developed by neuropsychologists Hayden Ellis and Andrew Young in the 1990s, is supported by skin conductance studies. When healthy individuals are shown photos of people they know, their skin conductance spikes. It's an involuntary physiological response to emotional recognition. When Capgras patients are shown photos of their loved ones, flatline, no response, the body doesn't react, the feeling isn't there. The delusion, in a very real sense, is the brain's attempt to make sense of a world that stopped making sense.
If David's brain were normal, he would react emotionally to this picture of his father. This in turn would stimulate an almost indiscernible increase of sweat on his skin and a heightening of electrical resistance that can be measured. The prediction is that when people with normal brains look at photographs of people they don't know, they will not respond emotionally. So there will be no change in skin resistance. But a familiar face will prompt an emotional response, and invariably there is a change. Now the question is, what happens with David?
This is obvious when you look at a Picasso or a Rembrandt or any beautiful picture. Even when you look at, say, your mother's face, the appropriate emotional warmth has to be evoked. Or when you look at a lion, you have to be afraid. And all of this is part of the visual process, but happening in a different part of the brain.
If Ramachandran's theory is correct, pictures of his parents will not evoke an emotional response, so the line should remain flat.
Now, this is also telling you about how all of us, how normal people, respond to faces and to objects, because what happens in this patient is truly extraordinary. The lack of emotional response actually leads him to this very profound delusion that this person is not really his mother. In other words, the lack of the autonomic gut reaction, this emotional response, leads him to an absurd conclusion, overriding what his intellect is telling him. And this tells you how closely linked your intellectual view of the world is to your basic emotional reactions to the world.
Going back to the original patient described by Capgras himself, Madame M was a woman in her 50s with a history of paranoid thinking who became convinced her husband had been replaced by a double, then her children, then the other people in her life. What's striking about her case is the scope. For most Capgras patients, the delusion is limited, usually targeting one or two people with whom they have strong emotional ties. For Madame M, it expanded. She also applied the delusion to herself, sometimes believing she had been duplicated, that the real her existed somewhere else, and the self she experienced was also an imposter. Capgras reported that she retained insight into the impossibility of her beliefs. She could acknowledge they were strange, but she could not shake them. The feeling overrode the reasoning every time.
David not only had delusions about people, he also believed that the house that he lived in was just an imitation of his home.
One day he started getting really angry. I want to go to my house. I want to go to David's house. I want to go to David's house. And we're in the apartment. And I'm just going, what am I going to do? So I decided, I said, okay, David, let's go. So I took him down the stairs. And I went around through the back, came back through the elevator, took him to bring, the same apartment. And I said, this is your house. And I opened the door and I said, okay, ciao. And I just left him there alone. It was the same apartment. And he looked at it and said, oh yes, this is my apartment.
In rarer documented cases, the delusion extends beyond people. There are patients who believe their house has been replaced by an identical copy, their car, their pet. One patient insisted that a series of identical duplicate cats were cycling through their home, that each day a new fake cat was substituted for the real one. Again, coherent within its own logic. If the mechanism is a disrupted emotional familiarity signal, there's no reason it has to be limited to faces. Any familiar stimulus could theoretically trigger the same mismatch. Capgras syndrome is not a diagnosis you get in isolation. It almost always occurs as a symptom within a broader clinical picture. The most common underlying conditions include schizophrenia, where it appears in the context of paranoid delusions, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, where it may emerge as the condition progresses, Lewy body dementia, which is particularly associated with misidentification syndromes, and traumatic brain injury, especially injuries affecting the right hemisphere and the connections between the temporal and limbic regions. there's also a significant gender and relationship pattern in the literature. Capgras delusions most commonly target spouses or romantic partners, the person with whom the patient has the most intense emotional bond. This isn't incidental. It maps directly onto the neuroscience. The stronger the expected emotional familiarity response, the more jarring the absence of that response. The people we love most are the ones whose faces should feel the most. When they don't, the cognitive dissonance is maximally severe. It's worth noting that Capgras syndrome is considered rare in absolute terms, but that may be underdiagnosed, particularly in elderly populations where it might be misattributed to general cognitive decline or dismissed as confused thinking. Perhaps the most chilling dimension of Capgras syndrome is what happens when the delusion drives behavior. There are documented cases of patients who became aggressive toward the imposter, in some cases violent. One case, reported in the neuropsychological literature, involved a patient who attacked and seriously injured his father, believing he was eliminating a dangerous double. The patient had no history of violence. He was not malicious. He was, by his own account, defending himself and his family from a threat he experienced as completely real. This is a dimension of the condition that rarely gets discussed outside clinical settings. Capgras syndrome can be dangerous, not because the person is deranged in a broad sense, but because the delusion is coherent and internally logical. If someone really had replaced your father, and you really couldn't tell the difference, what would you do?